You guys today. Now, today, Craig, in the realignment buzz circles was a big day in that this was the day that everybody who was convinced that Florida State was leaving the ACC right away has to notify the ACC. They have to also call a board meeting 24 hours before they make that decision, which they have not done, which means they are not leaving the ACC this year. It doesn't mean that they're not leaving the ACC eventually, but it did seem, and while I do believe that they've pretty much stated their case that they want to leave, it did seem a rather large legal mountain to climb in a very short amount of time to just say, we're leaving, we don't care about all the money, let's do it.
Yeah, this is always a little bit far-fetched in just the kind of time frame we were talking. You know, it started to feel like the expectations were for something to happen pretty immediately, and I think for everybody kind of unboxing the story, there was always one lingering question of like, okay, but what about the money? Like, what about that price tag and, you know, paying that? And so, of course, there was, you know, the private equity fund that was mentioned a couple of weeks back as being a possibility that apparently Florida State has dug into and, you know, checked all and weighed all their options. And so I feel like, yeah, they've done their due diligence. I just think that what they've probably found at this point, based on where we are, and there was this, you know, big quote-unquote deadline day today and all that, is that they've done their due diligence, and their due diligence has returned the information, and that information is that, hey, it's a little bit harder than just, you know, paying a big bounty fee, or not a bounty, but, you know, paying a big fee and walking out the door. And, you know, there's a little bit more to it. It's a little bit more complex than that. And, oh, yeah, that fee, by the way, is exorbitant. Like, it's not just a booster writing a $10 million check. It's far more.
It's 12 boosters doing that.
It's it's crazy money. And so, you know, I understand that Florida State boosters have money. I understand their desire to want to go play in the SEC or play in the Big Ten. I understand all of their motivations. I understand former quarterback Drew Weatherford being a big ringleader here, and I was reading his comments a few days ago, and I get all of it. But, you know, as far as actually laying out the course or the path for them to do so, it's filled with a few roadblocks that need to be encountered and challenged or dismantled in front of them before they're able to find that finish line in the SEC or in the Big Ten eventually. So I still think that that's where they're headed. I think that that's what they're going to be climbing over rocks and, you know, going down treacherous trails, trying to find every, you know, little shortcut that they can to cut off as much time as they can to get there as quickly as they can. But am I surprised that today there's like not an announcement of like, there, you know, it's happening? No, I'm not at all, because I feel like this is definitely going to take more time to play out.
Paxton, to answer your direct question to me on the chat, no, I did not expect anything to happen today because of this. Because I think, and I've said this from the beginning, that this is phase one of the plan. Phase one is very loud disruption. You know, scream as loud as possible that you are unhappy with the situation. Phase two is figure out how you can turn that noise into movement, and phase three is to move. But I also don't think one of the other reasons you can't leave until you have a place to go. And I don't think that this is like Texas and Oklahoma that had, you know, clearly some stretch of time of a couple of months of behind the scenes deal making with the SEC or USC and UCLA. This is the first part of it where they are publicly voicing their displeasure. And I think part of the reason they're doing it so loudly is they would like all interested parties to know that they are ready to go as soon as you call.
Well, but mission accomplished there.
But I don't think anybody has called yet, which is why they can't do it in secret. Because you can do it in secret, like Texas and Oklahoma, if somebody returns your call. So I don't think that that's happened for Florida State and Clemson yet, because I do think their situation is a little bit different than Texas and Oklahoma and USC and UCLA. I think that those brands are all, well, especially USC, Texas, Clemson, FSU, like those brands are all kind of on par with each other football-wise to varying degrees of where you want to go on the blue blood ladder, but they're all kind of on par with each other when it comes to recognition. Differences, obviously, some people are bigger than others, but they're all in that same kind of group.
Yeah,
but that doesn't mean that Florida State and Clemson can just do what Texas and Oklahoma did and call up the SEC and be like, you guys want to? And they're like, you know what? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and the major difference is that Oklahoma and Texas, didn't have 13 years remaining on their grant of rights.
Yeah.
USC and UCLA were free to walk. Like the timing of it lined up correctly. I think that's why, when the Pac-12 stuff was really reaching a fever pitch, and you were looking at, okay, like once this happens, then it's probably going to die down, right? Like it finally has to die down. And then, of course, there was the Florida State comments, and, all of that's now, really kind of taken the place. Although the Pac story still, we need to touch on that daily because that's still evolving. Like that's still not by any means a shut deal just yet. But I think, there was suddenly maybe an expectation for it to all keep happening quickly. Like we're going to fast forward through all of this. But I think, I'm on record and I couldn't point out where we said this, but we definitely in our conversation said that the timing doesn't line up for right now per se for all of that extra movement, but everybody getting their ducks in a row for a few years from now, then like all the contracts come up again around the same time. Now, granted, the ACC will still be under contract for several more years, but at that point, that seems like it would be more feasible. Now, could it happen before then? Of course, because, nobody really, even if you predicted Super League, even if you predicted, Oklahoma and Texas are going to move one day, even if you predicted those things, nobody's been 100% on all of this. Nobody predicted all of that, plus everything else that's already happened as well. No one predicted the Big 12 would gobble up the Pac, so there's definitely some unforeseen things that could occur, but I do think this is going to need some more time to play out because it just doesn't align financially or time-wise, rights-wise, all of that the same way the others did. Oklahoma and Texas had just a little bit amount of time remaining to buy out, which they eventually negotiated with the Big 12 and were able to get out of. But would they have been able to do that if it was 13 years remaining on that deal? No, I think it would have been a little bit more complicated. So, yeah, this is a more complex issue, but I don't think, the chirping will die down. Florida State's clearly said what they said. They made their intentions known. Everybody knows what their intentions are. Everybody knows what Clemson's intentions are. And, I'm curious to see what the appetite is because, the Big Ten's got a lot of unloading to do now from the other side of the country that is kind of more of a priority at the moment. The conference had said, well, we don't have any plans, and all of a sudden they've got Oregon and Washington coming on board. Mm-hmm. The SEC has said they don't have any plans, but with them, I think that certainly they have their own motivations, but I kind of believe them when they say that they're sort of just staying pat right now because I think the more prudent move for them is to not be necessarily the disruptor. I think the best move for them in the long run is to let this other situation play itself out like the Big Ten did with the Pac. Let others do the damage for you, and then when the moment's right, swoop in. But for right now, they've got a geographic conference that makes perfect sense. We'll be glad to welcome Oklahoma and Texas on board and can do that all safely and securely without too much other distraction. And then when the time strikes, go grab Clemson and Florida State or whatever at a more reasonable price. But right now, there's just, it's a lot of money left on the table that's got to be accounted for and a lot of years on that deal. And it just felt like it was trying to force something quickly. Now, look, maybe they have a rabbit up their hat, but it doesn't appear so, and certainly not today. There's no big news to report on any seismic movement. Yeah, look, it's not going to surprise me if and when they leave. No. It would just surprise me if it was today. Given that would have been very quickly. That would have whoever legally figured that out would have been set for life because every time somebody said, "Hey, I've got a big 12-year contract I need to get out of," they'd be like, "Oh, call this the super lawyer. He's figured it out how to break these things." On this note, in the ACC, we had David Teal on the show last week, and he hosts a podcast for Richmond.com with Mike Barber, who we've also had on the show, called Teal and Barber. They had ESPN.com's David Hale on the show, and he is probably the most frustrated person in the world when it comes to ACC rumors. Yes. He's that for sure. He's also one of the better ACC reporters and is dialed in. Yeah. So we have a couple minutes here from that podcast that I want to play for you guys so you can kind of get the explanation on what's going on in the ACC, not just from FSU's perspective, but from other coaches and administrators that David Hale has spoken with. Here is that segment from Teal and Barber. That was, I believe, either yesterday or today.
What would it take to appease Florida State other than giving them all the money? And B, what leverage do the Seminoles have?
I think there is some dollar figure that would probably appease them to an extent. But I remain a little dubious that this is entirely about dollars and cents for these schools. And look, we're going to talk about Florida State because Florida State has been out on their front porch yelling, "Get off my lawn!" Basically, like they are the vocal team. But there are other teams within this league that are essentially internally having the exact same conversations as Florida State. And as I've talked to them, I mean, they view the financial disparity between themselves and the SEC and Big Ten as an existential threat to their long-term success. And so making $30 to $40 million per year less is the crux of the problem. So is there a way that you could bridge that gap enough to make it worth their while to just stay put and stay quiet? Probably. I mean, there's probably a number that makes that work just because the difficulty of extricating yourself from the grant of rights is that level of difficulty is so high that at a certain point you say, like, well, this is, the calculus says that we should just stick around. But I think there's more to it than money. And I think one of the things that I've had coaches tell me, and I don't mean just coaches at Clemson and Florida State, I mean coaches around the league that have said, look, I'm dealing with stuff on the recruiting trail. Well, I've got players saying, you guys are the JV league because you're not making as much money. The SEC and the Big Ten, they get the money. Therefore, they are the better leagues. They are essentially the NFL of college football. I've also had many of those same coaches say, like, really? The Big Ten? Have you seen them play? Right. But I certainly think most people get the SEC argument. And so there is a level of cachet, of image, of just understanding the direction that the sport is going, of being able to be part of a league that has enough sway with the TV networks to ensure that your games are on in prime viewing windows, on prime viewing channels, and not, relegated to ESPN3 or Peacock. All of those things play a part in this conversation too. So yeah, at the end of the day, if Florida State could somehow get $25 million more per year from the ACC than they're getting right now, that's probably enough to quiet down this conversation for at least the foreseeable future. But even then, I think there is still going to be stuff that is pushing the conversation back towards this. And that's one of the concerns that I have gotten from other ADs and presidents and administrators around the league. So you ask, what's their leverage? Their leverage is, if you don't give us this, we will leave. And yes, leaving is not going to be easy for them, and it will be expensive. But if they do it, it is problematic for the ACC. And you don't need to look any further than what's happened to the Pac-12 to see that losing your big brands can have a dramatic cascading effect. But the flip side of that is, I have heard from a lot of these administrators who say the same thing, and particularly after the Board of Trustees meeting, which is, why do we need to appease them if they're going to leave anyway? And so when Florida State frames the problem as we're doing this because you can't fix this problem, there becomes no incentive to try to fix the problem. So I think, what they did at spring meetings worked, but I also think you're towing a very thin line there in which you give away the leverage that you have by making it a little too obvious that you have zero interest in staying no matter what.
That is the best I've heard it described, in that, yeah, look, why are they going to try to give Florida State more money if Florida State's kind of told them that they don't think they can, one, do it in the first place, and two, that they even really want to stay.
But they really want to leave. So in my head, I'm going to imagine this scenario where they just open the door for me and let me leave scot-free. Yeah. I've seen some of that, people trying to talk themselves into why that makes sense, but it doesn't make sense. So yeah. I think, the only reason it's really a story to begin with is obviously all the stuff that's been going on, but more so just the fact that they decided to speak up and be the most vocal party of the parties that are looking outside, through the window to the sunshine and the other side of the fence, and it looks so much better and richer and lush and all of that. And hey, I get it. I think that's a lot of programs in the country right now, ACC or otherwise, but yeah, it just doesn't really line up. So that deadline today was, apparently if they wanted to play next year in a different conference. And so no surprise, I don't think, to anybody really that deadline is not going to come into play, because man, that would be an amazing sequence of events to find yourself like all of a sudden playing in the last year of the ACC just like that. So yeah, this is going to take a little bit more time. I'd imagine we'll hear more cage rattling, more barking from various folks involved. And you know what? Probably an early exit at some point. How soon though is the big question that will still need to be figured out. But I'd imagine they're going to take these. Take on football season where they've got a really highly ranked and good team with, a bunch of preseason, attention, not only on the team itself, but on individual players. I mean, they're about as healthy as they've been in several years at this point. And so, you'll enjoy football season, and all the while in your free time, you'll be planning your exit strategy and how quickly you can get there. But for right now, they are still an ACC team and will remain that way for the foreseeable